Professor Shija, chairperson of this meeting, fellow academics, students and friends. When I was approached by Professor Manju to deliver this Professor K. Ramachandran Nair Memorial Lecture, I didn't think twice before saying yes, for more reasons than one. Of course, I was not his student, nor had the fortune of working as a colleague of his. We came from two different directions. But I came to know him after he joined the Department of Economics here, when both Professor P.G.K. Panikkar, Professor P.R. Gopinathan Nair, Professor E.T. Matthew were the heads of departments at that time. When he became head of the department, he also had the audacity to invite me to give a lecture or two here. And probably that was the last time that I came here. I also have close relations with his family because his daughter is married to somebody who was once upon a time my student, now Professor N.C. Narayanan. He did MPhil under me, not PhD. He was not that unfortunate. But he wanted to do PhD in the same institute that I did in the Netherlands. And he was so persistent that he didn't apply to anywhere else. And I was very happy to support his application. And lo and behold, he also got the same supervisor, Ashwini Seth, as one of his promoters. There you call them promoters. The professor promotes you to the level of Doctor of Philosophy. He not just supervises you, so he has a greater responsibility to see that you perform. Otherwise it affects him. He is charged with promoting the student to the level of doctorate. So since then we know very well. And I'm also very happy to say that Sindhu's daughter, Professor Ramachandran Nair's granddaughter, is following her great-grandfather's footsteps and now doing PhD in one of the leading universities in the United States, after having worked on a subject in which I have been working for a long time, on the informal labor. Not a very exciting topic or area, but that's what our country is made up of. Almost 80% of our workers are in the informal sector. So that's by way of my acquaintance with Professor Ramachandran Nair. I also didn't think twice before suggesting a topic, because it's a topic that I have been thinking and reading about for quite some time, but didn't really write about it as extensively as I did on the national economy. That's about the tumultuous changes that are taking place in the international economic order. I had the opportunity to work in the technical secretariat of the World Commission on Social Dimensions of Globalization. That was constituted by the Director General of the International Labour Organization, Geneva, which is part of the UN system. So I had some first-hand experience of witnessing the commissioners debating this topic, including Joseph Stiglitz, and it was chaired by the President of Finland and the Prime Minister of Tanzania, because in the UN system you also have to have a political balancing of formal commissions. Later on, I also worked with a collective of social scientists in the International Panel on Social Progress that was inspired by Professor Amartya Sen, but led by Ravi Kanbur and two others. Nancy Fraser, if some of you are here, sociologists or political sociologists, you might know Nancy Fraser. And there's another philosopher from Switzerland. But there is another intimate reason why I'm talking about it in our own state and to students here. We often think that things happening in the international arena don't really affect us. We talk about our little problems of students struggling for better hostel facilities, or somebody is raped, and all the political parties are fighting at each other, spitting at each other. So these all become our TV news. Anchors get excited, the round tables, and all kinds of things, completely oblivious of what's happening around the world, that could really determine our future as a country and as a society. So that's one reason one main reason that I chose this subject. Of course, I have been using this subject on several occasions, including the one which was organized by Professor Krishna Kumar. He is also secretary of the All India Professional Congress, Trivandrum chapter. So he brought students from different colleges, and we had an interesting conversation only a few weeks ago. But I promise you I'm not going to repeat all that I said, but although some repetitions might be there. Why I say emerging international economic order is because, can you go to the first slide, please? With the entry of United States and its allies in NATO, that's about 30 countries. Now, the conflict in Ukraine has created an inflection point for the international economic order. That means you reach a stage where you cannot any longer proceed along the same lines. You either go down, or you go up, or you deviate to something else. That inflection point is because the United States decided to use not just its military power in assisting Ukraine, but also its economic power, because much of the international economic system, as in trade, international financial transfers, and international finance, especially through World Bank and IMF, is largely, if not only, controlled by the United States. So they decided to weaponize these economic instruments against Russia. Although Russia is no longer a communist country, there is no ideological difference. So one doesn't really understand what is the enmity against Russia. Is it because of the moral anger that they attacked and subjected Ukraine to a very gruesome war? If that is the case, then it would be very difficult for the United States to take a moral stand, having destroyed several countries during the last 50 years, even recently, and won not a single war. They had the power of destruction, but not winning the hearts of the people, including Afghanistan, what happened. But it's also interesting, next one, that this particular weaponization of international economic instruments, which I will come to in more specifically, is not new. Because if you are reading newspapers, either in your mobile or in your computer or print, you would know that there are countries like Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, which are already under sanctions. And sanctions to such an extent they cannot conduct independent financial transactions for their international trade and other purposes. So they have been kept away from the international banking system to the extent Americans are dominating most of the international financial institutions. But these countries are surviving with great difficulty. But what they have done to Russia is much more serious, and it is becoming more serious now, and which exposed the American economic philosophy and economic system, because all that they are doing are against the principles of the free market. In a free market system, in a neoliberal world, you don't interfere in its working in a way that makes it completely beyond the purview of the market mechanism, like capping the oil price. How can you cap somebody else's commodity? If you are a buyer, you can bargain, and buyers can bargain. So market will reach an equilibrium through demand and supply. No, this is like an administrative fiat that I will not give and I will not allow others to give you more than $60 per barrel. Of course, this is completely gone, thrown to the wind, through to the winds, because the Russia said, if you are not going to purchase our oil at the price that we demand, we will not supply you. It's as simple as that. So they also use a non-market principle. So that's what it has come to. But in the process, this action, interfering, and also Russia has been put out of the international banking mechanism, where you have what is called the SWIFT. If you want to send money to your cousin or somebody else or buy something else from another country, you can make payment and it goes through a SWIFT system, Society for Worldwide International Financial Transfers, which is developed by a collective of bankers, but it is all located in the United States. It's not owned by the United States government, but it is in America. So they can say, no, don't allow this particular country to use this system. If you allow, then we will withdraw, which they cannot afford. So they just conform to that. So in a way, this has also almost put a stop, if not a complete full stop, but a considerable decline of what it meant to be globalization. Of course, globalization was never to the advantage or to the liking of the developing countries. It was imposed on them. And since Soviet Union had collapsed in 1990, most developing countries had nowhere else to go when they are in economic trouble. Till then they could use the East. It was then called the Eastern Sphere, Soviet Union and its Comecon, Eastern Europe and Eurasia. But that option is gone. So most developing countries willy-nilly agreed to the terms and conditions set in the World Trade Organization agreement. Some of them we bargained, got a little bit, some small concessions, but every developing country, entertained some kind of complaint, feeling of discrimination, and it still persists. So it was not a perfect one. And also the globalization that was imposed, I call it neoliberal globalization, because the philosophical principle for pushing that agenda, starting with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, it was politically led, was that you should allow the market to function freely and not allow the state to come in and interfere in its mechanism. Of course, it never happened in history like that. There was never a free market, just as there was never a complete state. Wherever a complete state control was experimented upon, like in Soviet Union, it collapsed. Because there are many things which state cannot really do at the micro level. So it was a total planning by the state. And here what is being advocated is a total freedom for the market. So that binary doesn't exist except in textbooks. But the kind of globalization that the West imposed, because America is in, I wouldn't say cahoot, but is in strong cooperation with Europe. So the West stands for America, Europe, and the Japanese have cannot have independent foreign policy or any major international position which is not to the liking of the United States, because after the Second World War, Japanese constitution was written under American supervision. There are restrictions. The security is the responsibility of the United States overall. Therefore, Japan cannot even have its own nuclear arsenal. So they are under the nuclear umbrella of the United States. So in a way they cannot. So, and they also culturally they have, I don't know how a people and country, not many people are asking this question. I often ask, how can, when your country was bombed twice and completely destroyed for generations, because people children who were born immediately after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had several deformities. And still you love the country which bombed you out. Maybe that's a way of survival. In the Japanese mind, you don't know. Also, the politics, they cultivated the whole system in such a way that they like to project themselves as part of the West, although they are geographically East Asian. They follow, of course, they have certain strong Asian values, sense of hierarchies, superiority, inferiority, deference to elders, and very restrictive freedom for women. We might think that our society is bad enough for much of our women folk. But in Japan, however educated you are, the first responsibility after you marry is to look after the parents of your husband. It's ingrained in the Japanese. And that's why many of the young Japanese don't like to marry. And if they marry, they don't like to have children. If they have children, by many of my Japanese friends, including some cultural anthropologists, she told me, by 45, 50 we divorce. Because then we can freely travel and go around. Because otherwise you can't do that unless the husband gives you the permission. And these are some hidden features of the Japanese. It may not be as dramatic as I am telling you, but you can imagine in India also, if somebody says you something, we'll say, no, it's my house, it's not just like that. I have enough freedom. You may have enough freedom in your house, but not in your society. So that's the way it is. So they also become then part of the West. For all international politics and economics, they align with the, that's why they are member of the G7, as I have shown here. But this globalization was restricted to free movement of goods, services, part of the services, capital, banks, inter-country transfer of finance, but not for technology, not for movement of the people. You can't freely go. If there is a job there, you can't just freely apply a visa and get automatically and go there. No. There are quotas, restrictions, and some countries you have freedom. If you are an Australian and UK and America, you can freely go because you are all white. But if you have to go to UK, you have to wait. If you have to go to United States, you have several tests. I think the visa appointment time is 20 months. So that's the kind of globalization that we have. But nevertheless, there was some degree of freedom for developing countries to exploit the opportunities for trade. And if you are good at it, and you can even benefit by it, like the Chinese did, and we did to some extent in the services sector, like the information technology. When I say emerging international economic order, you have to keep in mind that when America weaponized these financial instruments and other economic instruments against Russia, except the West, G7, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, no developing country supported them. And that's strange. We have more than 200 countries in the United Nations. When the General Assembly took up the Ukraine issue, there was no country which unilaterally supported the United States except the Western Alliance. That sends a very powerful message that we are not happy the way that you are, because this could be used against anybody in future. So that's why each country is worried about when you are going beyond the conventional conflictual resolution mechanism to weaponizing economic instruments. So we do have now a much more sharper division between the West and the rest. You can say statistically the rest is all the developing countries plus Russia and other transitional economies. But I am going to redefine the rest because not all the countries are equally powerful to give a counter to the West. Just as the West itself often is symbolized by a smaller number of powerful countries in group of 7, the G7 countries. But they give the leadership to the Western world. So this is the kind of classification I would make. West defined as America, United Kingdom, because now it's out of European Union. Then all the countries in the European Union are 27 countries, small and big. Actually, it doesn't really matter except 3 or 4. If there are Europeans here, they may not like me telling this way, but it's true. France, Germany, to some extent Italy, although Italy is now a little weak. These are the countries which decide the EU's major agenda. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Japan. So these are around 33 countries. Numerically 33 countries, but actually often represented by G7. The rest is now being projected through the combination or collective strength of BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Although there are only 5 countries against the 33 countries in the West, it's basically between G7 and BRICS 5. But what is interesting, the evolving, that's what I said, emerging international economic order, BRICS is now going to become BRICS Plus. Saudi Arabia has already informed the BRICS that they would like to join. That will be a major event in the international economic order for several reasons, including the power of Saudi Arabia lies not in its economy, but in its ability to determine oil prices and the supply of oil, which is very crucial. Just like Russia. Russia could withstand all these sanctions because it is one of the most important members in oil production. Iran is the same, but Iran lacks in military strength to counter any other attack by the United States. So there are something like 11 countries which are closer to the BRICS. And many of them are likely, they are already observer status, like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Argentina, Egypt, Turkey, Indonesia. And at least Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Argentina are likely to become members sooner than later. So I take the rest representing BRICS Plus. Because so far BRICS has acted in a manner which is not just in the interest of these 5 countries, but in the interest of all the developing countries. So it's natural, like we had leadership role in the G77 in the 70s and 80s. Now I think the BRICS is taking over that place. Next one, please. Now, one should not underestimate the power of the West, even with all these changes that are taking place. It is evolving and declining for the West, not in absolute money power, but in relative shares. And it still dominates the international financial institutions like IMF and World Bank. If some of you are doing international economics, you know why. They hold the majority voting share there because of their contribution of money, and they are unwilling to change that, despite the fact that countries like China, India, Turkey, they are becoming more and more economically significant and give them a proportionate representation in IMF, despite the cry for reforming those institutions. International banking system is also largely controlled by the instruments that I talked about by the West. Although India, China and Russia, they have developed their own softwares for bank transfer, like UPI in India. As there's a similar one in Russia, SIPS I think. Then there is a much more popular one in China where more than 100 countries are already using it. So China is one of the most emerging powers. But I will not put the whole international economic changing order as one between America versus China. That will be too reductionist, and they will lack the credibility if they go it alone. Even for America, they have to have the Europeans with them, and the Canadians, if not the Australians and New Zealanders who are far away. And therefore, I think the grouping is much more significant in the international economic order than just the rise of China as a counter to the United States. Although we should not underestimate the enormous economic power that China has come to have through sheer internal efforts. It is not developed by external effort. They may have used external technology much money and all that, but it is their internally driven processes through institutions and structures. So I would, in this, of course, we should also note that Asia is the emerging counter to the West. But again, I will not, like many other people have done, just put all my eggs on Asia, because you just cannot ignore powers like Brazil and Mexico. They are important economies, and Brazil has a much more clout in their region than India has in South Asia. And Africa, two economies, Nigeria and South Africa, are quite important. So I would therefore emphasize the collective power of BRICS Plus as against the portrayal of China as the counter to the West. Now, in international economic order, politics is also important. That's one of the reasons why dollar became the most important currency, not just because the United States was the winner of the World War and the largest economy which was unaffected directly by any devastation of the World War, and they had the biggest or the largest economy, but also the strongest military power. Of course, Soviet Union was the counter, but then they had carved out a different sphere of influence. And that's why we had the Cold War for a long time. But at the moment, the strength of the rest, that is the BRICS Plus, is mainly due to the combination of Russia and China. And they have said our alliance is all-weather. And it's a signal that if necessary, we might combine our military strength. But that is not necessary in international politics. Postures are enough. So I will later on tell you that if you take military strength, very interestingly, the BRICS has almost equal military power like the NATO. Some history of this very difficult process of international economic order in the 60s and 70s, when developing countries started feeling that they are not getting their due, the space for development through international effort, technology transfer, development finance, access to markets, they were not taking place as envisioned by the United Nations in the 1964 International Development Strategy. There was a demand, collective demand for a new international economic order in favor of the developing countries, because they were numerically the largest group in the United Nations. But they were only numerically the largest, they didn't have the economic clout. But nevertheless, they didn't stop at that. Internationally, that demand continued, and they created a South Commission which produced a report. And if some of you are interested in knowing the recent history of the demand for a new international economic order by developing countries, you should refer to this report called The Challenge to the South, report of the South Commission. Interestingly, the South Commission report was prepared under the secretaryship of none other than Dr. Manmohan Singh. Immediately after the publication of this report, he came and assumed the finance ministership. And again, unfortunately, much of the policies that he followed were not exactly what he wrote in the South Commission. That was realpolitik. But there were some, next one please, there were some unintended consequences of this globalization. It did not really always work in the interest of the North. Although they thought the globalization, they have become the sole power, Soviet Union had collapsed, and even political scientists like Francis Fukuyama wrote the end of history, as if there is no more history to be written, because the neoliberal economic order and political liberal democracy, these twins, this is going to be the permanent state of affairs of modern world. So what is there in no future history? It's just a continuation. But poor fellow didn't realize that within 20 years all these things change, and now he must be really worrying that why did I write the way I wrote? And if you look at the writings of a prolific writing by Joseph Stiglitz, and he started with the book Globalization and Its Discontents, and you will realize why this globalization did not go the way it did. And he says that one of the reasons for many of the people in the North, that is global North, America, Europe, but middle class, working class are against the globalization because they lost their jobs. Their corporations relocated the investment to China and other countries, and service sector, ICT firms to India and other countries, and most of them lost their jobs because it could be produced cheaply here, serviced cheaply here. So it was in the interest of the corporations that the WTO agenda was framed, not in the interest of the people of those countries. Just as the people of the southern countries, global south, that is, the developing countries, also get compromised when our countries sign agreements, as in the WTO, in agriculture, for example. We don't have still access to the market, agriculture market in developed countries because they are highly protected. While those countries will tell you, preach you that don't give any more subsidies, that's bad. But they give enormous subsidies to agriculture. The biggest subsidy country for agriculture is Japan, followed by EU, and the third by United States. So they will have the cake and eat it too. You just have to watch. But in this case, although it produced, in both developing countries and in the north, it produced more inequality. The main characteristic of the globalization, although it gave a boost to the growth process as a whole, because more trade, more technology transfers, and if not more jobs, because technology was substituting jobs. So it's a jobless growth story, not just in India, in most other places also. But it resulted in more unemployment, more inequality. That's why you must have read in newspapers 1 by 99, 1% versus 99% when Obama was there, and then subsequently the movement against inequality in United States. You must also be familiar, I'm sure, Thomas Piketty's writings on capital, the age of capital, and why inequality has become so ingrained in the process of economic growth in this modern world under globalization. Because globalization privileges high education, high skill, high finance, high consumption, and these structurally are only available to a smaller section of people in poor countries and a little more bigger section in the developed countries, but in both sides they lose on employment. On India alone, many have written, and on the jobless growth, I myself have written on this, on the jobless growth process that is taking place in India. Despite, then you can even wonder as students, why with such high growth rate over 30 years time, a trend rate of growth of 6% per annum for more than 30 years in India, we are still talking about high unemployment, women's lower participation in the labor force, and a whole rate of issues. So this is what I dealt with in the book on interrogating inclusive growth. But interestingly, because a few countries, and which were later christened as emerging economies by the World Bank and IMF, they did so well, and the leader is China, Brazil, India, Turkey, Thailand, many other countries. It shifted the economic power somewhat away from the Western countries. Traditionally, they used to be the leaders. It shifted slowly but steadily. And this has been documented by a very outstanding Indian economist, Deepak Nair, who is a macroeconomist, in his book Catch Up, Developing Countries in the World Economy. Next one, please. Yes, this one. And he identified 14 countries which really made it good in the process of globalization in terms of output growth, if not employment. And he calls it the next 14. That means those countries which could come in the leadership level. And that's why I have included them, most of them, because he leaves out Saudi Arabia for good reasons. But I think politically it is now becoming more important in the BRICS Plus. So that's what I said. But if you want to know what is going on in the international economic decision-making level, and how the discontent about globalization really gave rise to the rise of right-wing political parties like the Trump, or the right-wing parties in Hungary, now in Italy and other places, where usually earlier we thought this unemployment and other restlessness will cause a leftward shift like Bernie Sanders, which is there but not very worldwide. But the people in the north, rich countries, have now become anti-immigrant. They want an excuse. They are taking away our jobs. Whereas it is the corporations who have taken away their jobs and the policies of their governments. And how the discontent is now playing out is in the latest book of, not latest, but recent book of Joseph Stiglitz, Globalization and Its Discontents Revisited. So he is revisiting his earlier book, Anti-Globalization in the Era of Trump. That's the subtitle. It is pre-Ukraine. I'm sure there will be another book after Ukraine because things are moving so fast. But then at least some of you might ask me, what does this shift away from West indicate quantitatively? Is it strong enough to withstand? So I tried some very simple measures, 2 or 3 I will show you. And this is measuring the world GDP in current US dollars for 2 points in time, 30 years ago and now, 1991 and 21. So in the West, as I defined here, the 33 countries, EU 27 plus United States, United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, the G7, they accounted for 74%, 3/4 of the world output in 1991, the blue line. But now in 2021, it has reduced to, their share reduced to 54% of the world total. It is still majority, major share, but not big enough to unilaterally impose your will, because things are taking place in other parts. If I take only BRICS from 7%, 6.9, to 26%. So if I include the other emerging economies, the 11 countries that I identified, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, it will now account for about 34, 35%. So 35% is no small measure to provide, and by just 16 countries collective against the combined strength of the West. So there is a shift in world output, but not significant. But then you can say this is in current US dollars. You are being told also that the real measure is the purchasing power of the dollar, PPP, purchasing power parity. So I give you that in the next, in this one, which is very interesting. But I must also tell you that purchasing power parity really represents the command over goods and services within each country. So what does it mean is that you take, there is a huge international comparative project on prices, and United Nations have pitched in because they need to make these estimates in PPP dollars, where you take a basket of goods consumed by most countries, people in the most countries, and say this basket of goods, how much it will cost in the United States. Let's take the basket costs $100 per day, okay? And then say for the same basket of goods, you come to India and say, and you pay in rupees, and how much will it cost? When they do that, they think that the amount of rupees given to for the same commodity, same basket, is only around $30 equivalent. So every official dollar of the United States is 3 times worth in commodities and services in India. But in the official exchange rate, it doesn't reflect. That's why countries' GDPs, when comparing each other, they revalue in PPP dollars. If you take the PPP dollars, it's very interesting that the share of the West goes down to 41%. And the share of the rest, that means the BRICS 5 plus 11, goes up to 45%. And the rest is for the other countries, which is a very significant one. So that means for the same amount of money in these developing countries, you can command more resources, and which we know. If you go to New York and you want to have a coffee, or even Geneva, where every time I go for a coffee in the railway station, I used to think, oh, 3 francs, $3. If you value that now, it's about 240 rupees. You can get maybe 5 best coffee here. So if only coffee is the only consumption, it is 5 times cheaper here. So that's the kind of thing. So it doesn't matter whether the United States is spending, let's say, $100 billion for their military. If we have $30 billion, we can get the same kind of. So the real power is reflected in the PPP valuation, although it is not an exchange rate in the official exchange rate. So you have to take the official exchange rate for actual payments. But when you import something, you pay $1 by 80 rupees. So basically you are transferring 3 times the resources here to the other country. That's the disadvantage of having a disparity between the official dollar and the PPP dollar. But you come to another important indicator of this power equation, because people also matter. So if you take population share, the West is only now 13% of the global population. Out of every 100 people, only 13 people are there in the West. In the BRICS, it is just BRICS alone, 5 countries alone, 41%. These 5 countries, and China and India together, plus the other 3, 41%. But if you include the other 11, it will be 53%. So majority of the population is represented by these 16 countries, BRICS plus countries. And you cannot just dismiss this power of the people, although they may be poor. You can attack Iraq, or you can isolate Afghanistan, but you can't easily attack Indonesia, China, or India. That will be beyond, they can't swallow it, It's too big to manage. Area share, which is also an important this thing. The West accounts for just less than 1/4 of the world's land area, 23%, whereas BRICS alone around 30%, and if you take BRICS plus, it's about 40%. And it's very interesting that the BRICS area, 3 countries, Russia, China, and India, in one block, is contiguous, which is also a tough challenge for an enemy. If you stand together, that's a big if. If you stand together, it's very difficult to confront you. But then more mundane things with day-to-day things. Next one, please. Exports, if you take 50%, 64% of the exports were by the Western countries. Now down to 50%, half. Which means, of course, the rest is, BRICS plus is only 29%. The rest is by other smaller countries. But the fact that the 50% is beyond the West is also an important shift of. So I am not really talking about just the political and the feeling of, you are different and you are now. In the 70s, in the 80s, when the countries demanded for a new international economic order, this was not a statistic. So they couldn't back up their demand with real economic clout. But now you can cut off from a theoretical point of view. If you get cut off from the West, you will not starve. Because you can produce most of the things that are produced there, except perhaps bombs. So that's the value of diversification in countries like India, China, Russia. That's how they are also, despite some sanctions, they can survive. Imports also. Imports is little more accounted for by the West because they import a lot more, their currency is strong. So what I would like to say is, unlike in the past, yes, the current situation is characterized by a clear shift of economic weight or power in favor of the leading countries in the global south, BRICS plus. This is a historic shift during the last 200 years. It never happened during the last 200 years in the modern world. We were colonies. subjected. So politically also you were subjected. After the World War, within the span of, let's say, 70 years, this shift has occurred. So in historical time, it's a fantastic achievement. There are reasons to believe that this process will continue short of a massive exogenous shock. If, as we say in economics, other things remaining the same, then this situation will continue. But if there is a third world war, I hope there will not be, but you can't rule out, then the situation will be different. It will be much more calamitous for most countries, not just the global south. Or a pandemic. Just look at the experience during COVID. You just can't move out of your house. And even within your house, if you get COVID, you can't see other members of your house. How powerful nature is, without any bomb, without any arsenal. It just made all of you stop, all of us stop. The entire world came to almost a stop. That's why now they talk about supply chain disruptions. What it means is that there is nobody to work, produce things in China and ship it to the port, and then the ships to come and people to receive. There is no contact. So it also gives a very interesting dimension. The nature is saying that just don't get too excited by globalization, that everything can be, by through exchange. You must have some self-reliance to look after your bad days. So countries like India, China did not suffer much because they are large and diversified. Unfortunately, countries like Sri Lanka, many Latin American countries, smaller countries suffered because many of their things had to come from outside. They can't produce everything that they wanted. And that's how the impact is now seen in their inability to pay back the money, because whatever reserve they had to pay it for the higher prices of oil and other things. So they didn't have enough reserve in that sense. In the international finance, why dollar is still dominant is evident from this table. Although we have seen that in terms of export and imports, even American share is lower than the West as a whole, but you will see that countries hoard dollars, although the share has come down from 85% of the total reserves of each country, this is global estimate, 85% in 1970 was in the form of US dollars. It went down very drastically to 47 by 1990 because of Soviet Union and other countries at that time. But once it collapsed again, it rose. But it went down, now it's just 59%. 59% is significant, but it is lower than 75% in the 1970s. Euro took off very well, but it lost its speed. It's only 20% of the world reserves are kept in euro. You need another lecture on the euro, because although euro is a currency of say 17 countries within the European Union, euro area, not everybody has accepted it. As an economist, you will find that you cannot really sustain a currency without a country. A country means you have a unified system of banking where you have a central bank. You have single monetary policy. You have a single fiscal policy. But their currency is more for trade and commerce and for people to transact. That avoids commissions and all kinds of complicated accounting. But when Greece is in trouble, the others are not helping. But in India, China, Australia, or United States or federations, if one state is in trouble, it's not their problem, it's a national government's problem as far as external payments are concerned, isn't it? So it is internally absorbed. But the German banks and the French banks did not come and bail out the Greek, and they got very upset with that. Unlike the English, they can't come out of it because they are too weak. They still want the free money that is distributed among the countries of the Europe. There's a common fund. Same thing with Ireland, Portugal. So they're all murmuring. That is also, you find the euro bonds are denominated by their countries. So that the German bond, they can sell easily for 2% yield, 2% interest. But if Greek issues a bond, they have to pay 8% because their credibility is low. So in a way, that's why people are not holding too much of euro. Even this 20%, I guess, is due to the member countries' reserves and not to other countries. But what is interesting is, for the first time, Chinese renminbi has made an entry, and now almost 3% of the global reserves are in Chinese renminbi, which means a lot of countries are storing renminbi, the yuan, as another form of foreign exchange reserves, along with dollar and other things. So there is a big demand now to move out of dollar, moving away from dollar, but a single non-dollar international currency is yet to emerge, which is very difficult. And the ideal solution should be an independent global reserve currency as recommended by the UN Commission of Experts. After the 2008 great financial crisis that started with the collapse of the Lehman Brothers Bank, Goldman Sachs and others, which spread to Europe in no time because the banking systems of those countries are integrated and currency trade is very common. That means you can hold a dollar and put it in the bonds and get an interest. But if the UK pound is giving a higher interest, you can just transfer your money to pound and get that. But we were, both China, India, we were very reluctant to integrate our banking system in terms of currency trade and convertibility. This is called the free convertibility of your currency. Since that was not there, and we are still cautious. Why we are cautious? The Chinese are also cautious. Despite Chinese renminbi is being accepted as a reserve currency, it's still not a freely convertible currency for the Chinese. Because they want to be very cautious. They don't want, if there's a run on their currency, like Indonesia did it very unwisely earlier. And during Suharto's period, Asian financial crisis, the Indonesian rupiah lost more than 80% of its value. Oh, not 80, maybe 40% or something of its value, which is an enormous risk. So there is already a report which, after the 2008 financial crisis, the Western countries realized that they cannot carry on with the business as usual, and therefore agreed to the demands, because that's the time when G7, they said, let's not discuss everything in G7, let's go to G20 by expanding G7. So it's basically again a creation of the G7 by inviting important economies, including Russia, and they had to. At that time there was no tension. This is before the Crimean takeover. But it's a very uneasy coexistence in the G20. 10 rich countries and 10 non-Western countries. 10 Western countries and 10 non-Western countries. But for the first time, they agreed the demand of the developing countries that there should be a reform of the international monetary system, both in IMF and the World Bank. They also agreed that it may not be a very good idea to continue with the dollar as a reserve currency, because dollar is a national currency. If a national currency also becomes an international currency, the demand for international transactions will have to be met by the Reserve Bank, the Federal Reserve System of the United States. That means they have to run deficits on their current account so that they can release more money. But it also becomes easy for them because all these reserves are held in US Treasury bonds. It goes back to them, they'll give an interest. Instead of keeping our Reserve Bank of India keeping all the dollars to itself, it will put it in the Federal Reserve so that it will get a rate of interest. Just like you have so much money, but you don't keep everything in currency. So you put it in the bank, so your money is safe, plus you get an interest. So it's the same way. But then, in this case, the US has to run a deficit. They have to keep on supplying the dollar. But when it comes back to them in the form of treasury bonds, they can also spend it in a profligate manner. And that's how they financed Vietnam War and Afghan War. So basically the rest of the world also paid indirectly for these war efforts because their currency was international currency. So that's a danger. It's an advantage for America, but a danger for the rest of the world. But it can also become a problem for United States, because if suddenly some countries unload their dollar reserves and say, no, we don't want anymore, it will flush the US monetary system and will create inflation because excess money coming back, and it will disequilibrate their economy. So that they realized during the financial crisis and agreed for some reform of the international financial system. But the real forum for discussing all these things should be the United Nations, not G7, G20. These are informal groups of powerful people. United Nations is the democratic forum where the General Assembly has all the countries in the world represented, like a parliament. So that parliament passed a resolution that we must have a single global reserve currency, unattached to any one country, and we need to work it out. So they invited Joseph Stiglitz to be the chairman, with very important members from different countries, both developing and developed. India was represented by the former very distinguished governor of the Reserve Bank, Y.V. Reddy. And they worked out in this report, if you read the report, if you are interested in the international economics, you should read this report. Very fine report, but written in a non-technical manner, and submitted to the President of the General Assembly. But the rich countries didn't want to discuss that. Basically, America opposed it because that will be the end of the dollar being used as a reserve currency, which they may not be ready for because their dominance will go. Now, I will give you one example. India does its international trade, export and import, and prices all these goods and services in terms of dollars. But if your trade is only with the United States, it's only 5%. You need only that much dollars. But even if you are selling things to Bangladesh or buying from Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, you denominate in dollars. And they have to pay dollars, you have to give dollars. Which means both countries have to hold dollars as a reserve. That could have been avoided by an international currency unattached to a dollar system. If you are also familiar with the Keynesian economics and some history of the international monetary system, after the Second World War, this is exactly what Keynes proposed in the Bretton Woods Conference. And he called it banker, the new currency, where every country will subscribe, we will have a common fund, and then that will be allocated to member countries on a scientific criteria depending on your share of output and or whatever other criteria. And it will be cleared by a clearing union. Just like within our country, Reserve Bank of India acts as a clearing agent for many transactions. And the Reserve Bank of India is charged with printing money, circulating money, controlling it, exactly in the same manner. So you can increase the volume of money, the volume of trade and volume of economic activity increases. So it will be an independent authority. The Americans didn't want because they were then the very most powerful. So that's why much of economics is also driven by politics. And the other way around also. We just cannot separate, although in neoclassical economics you are being taught that it's all by the forces of supply, demand, and the equilibrium conditions and all that nonsense that you'll hear. So I would recommend this for you. What are India's opportunities? India's opportunities, first thing is to reduce the dependence on US dollar. And we have, now people say, we have 600, now $560 billion as reserve. And we take it as a great, and the Pakistanis will say, oh, we don't have anything, $9 billion, we don't have money to pay back. That's true. But we are paying a price for that. We are paying a price for that because these dollars, part of it, because part of it is in gold, part of it is in other currency, a good part of it in dollars, is put in the US Treasury in the form of Treasury bonds. Let's say they are giving, because earlier the interest rate was zero interest rate in America because of quantitative easing. I'm using all these technical jargon, but the simple language is that they give you an interest on deposits. Supposing they give you now a 2% interest on your dollar reserves in the form of bonds. But if their inflation is 4%, you are losing 2% of value. And now the inflation there is 6%, 7%. So depending on the inflation in the United States, you are losing the real value of the dollar that you are holding. That's the price that you are paying for a bad weather situation. So it's a price that you are willing to forgo for reducing your vulnerability. Because every country felt very vulnerable during the financial crisis, Asian crisis, then the great financial crisis. So as a precaution, they are holding on. And also, if there is an international currency without the dollar, unattached to any country, you don't need to hold so much, because there is a system. You can approach it when there's a deficit. You can borrow money, pay an interest, just like our banks do. If they have excess money, they put it in the reserve system of the Reserve Bank of India, and they pay them in interest. That's called the repo rate, no? That's why the bank policies change. And if they want money, either they can interbank transfer, or the Reserve Bank of India will give them at an interest. So as the basic principle is the same. So how do we do that? What we are now doing is we are trying to internationalize the rupee and engaging in rupee trade with other countries. Interestingly, because Russia is expelled from the dollar financial system, they are willing to do that. And they are also giving you a discount for their oil, which is also to make it more favorable to the friendly country. And you pay in rupees, they pay in rubles, which means you can have account in their country for your bank, and their country bank will have an account here, and they will clear it. But it works perfectly well when your export and imports match. If it doesn't match, if Russia has more rupees, because it exports more, that's the thing, we import less, then what do they do with the excess rupee? Other countries are not able to accept it, unlike dollar. So that's the reserve nature. So India is saying, okay, if you hold excess rupee, we will give you treasury bills, we will give you an interest rate. Interest adjusted to our inflation so that you don't lose in real terms. But this is a limited arrangement. That's what China is now doing with Russia. Russia is doing with India. China is now going to do with Saudi Arabia. There are several. But China is also pushing its currency as an international reserve currency, which IMF has accepted because of their economic strength. So legally, other countries can hold yuan. But then it becomes just like a shift from dollar to yuan. It's also one country. So that's why they are not got so many countries to subscribe to that. Partially they do because we are doing more business with China. So we need to have an international independent reserve currency system. And whether until that political time comes, I think countries will continue to do the second best solutions of bilateral or regional arrangements, things like that, they will continue to do. Of course, long-term challenge for India is, we have to cooperate with other BRICS countries. Our border issue with China, if it comes in the way of our economic cooperation, then the possibility will be limited. Then your room for maneuver will be limited. So as Jagadish says, jagada, no jagada. You will have to have some basic cooperation, and both have to be realistic enough. Whether that will take place or not, that is a big elephant in the room, and we have to wait for that. India will also have to cultivate its trade with other developing countries, because only when you can purchase more from others, you can give more. So basically, your dependence on the developed countries have to be reduced. To that happen, we should also extend whatever technology we have to them. We should also probably in a limited way, although we are giving, but that's very insignificant, development finance to them. Like China is doing, but China can do it because it has got so much of surplus in their current account, $3 trillion. So they started this Belt and Road Initiative. It's basically development finance being given to other countries so that other countries will buy more from China, because those projects will demand machinery and other raw materials which will come from China. So it will also boost Chinese trade, because China is financing that project. This is what happens even earlier. The Japanese or the Koreans are giving you the K-rail. It's not they are not giving you for free. They will also price the rail. So the entire money will go back to them in terms of the railways and other consultancies and all that. So that's a different kind of thing. I'm just reiterating that why did the non-Western countries, not a single one, went along with USA in their sanctions against Russia or in their overall economic position and international economic order? Because most of these countries have a history of being discriminated against. Not, of course, Western colonialism is not the product of USA, but they were part of the European civilization. But even after the Second World War, many governments were thwarted by the United States. Many countries, they just under the pretext of weapons of mass destruction, they just attacked Iraq, hanged the president of a country, and got away with it. Completely destroyed a peasant society like Afghanistan, and just ran away after that. In Vietnam, that happened. So in many, Yugoslavia was destroyed and made into 6 other countries. So they just lacked the moral fiber to say that you be with us in this war of Russia against Ukraine. So other countries saying it's your war, it's your problem. As Jayashankar put it, it's a European problem. When there is a European problem, you put it as a world problem. When there is a world problem, you don't take it as your problem. So basically he is saying you are harvesting what you were sowing the other day. So that, and this is very important, although we are all talking about economics, behind economics there is also muscle power. And if you compare NATO is a sum of all the US, France, Italy, UK, Japan, Turkey and other countries. So if you do that, look at Russia alone, look at Russia, China together, look at Russia, China, India together. In most of these things there is parity or even more than parity. And Russia alone can match the NATO power in many respects, except military aircraft, whether it's nuclear power or it's tanks, aircraft, submarines. So that is one reason why the Americans are not entering the Ukraine war directly, because that will then become a major confrontation. Will the decline of the West help the rest as represented by BRICS and BRICS Plus? It's yes and no. The simple economics is that the Western countries represent much of exports and imports and consumption because the per capita income is high. If they are weakened and their rate of growth is slow and emerging economies is very high, if they go through a recession, then the demand for oil, demand for basic commodities like steel and other things will go down. The international price of these commodities will be less. And countries like India, China and other developing countries will pay less of an import bill. And that will become a cause for their economic growth. So somebody is losing, then somebody is gaining, because the somebody gaining has already built up the capacity. Now, unlike earlier, that's what I showed, the shift of the GDP. So it could be, and in my own non-economic, highly biased, personalized thinking, I think decline of Europe will be a boon for Asia. Because the Asian demand will go up, already Asian capacity to produce is high. So nobody has to really be sad about if the Europe declines or European economy. But American case is slightly different because they still produce some of the very advanced technologies and ICT software systems and all that. So one doesn't really know how it is going to affect. It might moderate the growth, but I think still if it reduces the consumption demand, then that slack will be picked up by the growing economies. Or it could become weaker because financial systems will be weaker, development finance will be less, the flow of portfolio finance will be less, the flow of foreign direct investment will be less. But in my view, except very small states, the big economies are not dependent on foreign direct investment. I don't have an example where a country has developed by foreign direct investment? You tell me if there is one. Including South Korea, although so much aligned to the United States, much of the South Korean investment came from within their own domestic savings and investment. And that's the lesson East Asia gives. Well, India's opportunity is a growing economy with a large domestic market emerging as a digital power. Declining West could mean lower prices, that I already said, strong and growing trading connections, because we also have niche markets. For example, we are now much more well integrated with the Middle East, thanks to Kerala also, because a lot of our labor is there. So you have a diaspora market. You can get your banana chips, you can get your Malayalam films, you can get your newspapers earlier than you get here, or the best fish. And that's market integration, no? A lot of exports and imports. They also send money. And UAE has emerged as one of the major trading partners of India. So if you look at India's external trade, export and import, majority of the trade is outside of USA and Europe. USA-Europe remains important, around 35% together, but the 65% is outside these two trading areas, which is very important, which was not the case 30 years ago. So that's what could emerge as a modern service providing economy, because ICT, like UPI services, these are all, the Americans are also looking at. The Visa and MasterCard are worried because the use of these cards have gone down. You have to pay for them. No, if you get a credit card, you pay a fees to the bank. Part of it goes to the credit card issuing. Also, every transaction, the merchant has also to pay. But if you use UPI, nobody pays. So the service has been made easy by the national corporation, whatever is it, credit card corporation that we have created. So now many countries are looking at such technological softwares. Emerge as a hub for higher education, modern traditional healthcare, but those are matters of detail. But the big opportunity is in the green economy, if you are serious about it. If you are not serious about it, you are persisting with your coal culture, with a high energy building construction, concrete culture, then you don't have much of an option. But if you are willing to innovate on all these things, there's a big market waiting out there. And that's a measure. Of course, you need more investment for that. But more than investment, you also need more determination. You cannot say, like some of our political leaders say, come what may, we will implement the project, even if it is against the environment. That's not democracy. That's not democracy. It makes no sense from an environmental point of view. If you don't heed to the environment, it will give you back, like COVID. And maybe like in the form of floods that we went through. And you can't still find out what reason that we had to go through such a devastating flood in 2018. So it will be a random occurrence of a kind that you cannot even predict. So there is an opportunity as well as a threat. That means if you don't heed it, it's a threat. But if you heed it, you can manage. One of the biggest challenges for India is, if you look at the BRICS, India is one of the weakest countries in terms of fundamentals of human development. It's not just in per capita income. India has the lowest per capita income, but that will grow, because if you are growing at 6%, you don't have to be worried too much. But look at an indicator like life expectancy. It's only second after South Africa. Others are much ahead. Average years of schooling, the lowest, 6.7. HDI is a summation of all these, 6.3. Which means your internal strength, you must have enough boost. I am a, Complan boy. And you have to say that collectively. Because if you are not strong and stand on your own, if you have so much of deprivation and poverty, nobody is going to respect you in the international arena, even if you have technologies to give, even if you have your smart foreign ministers and all that. To some extent it can, for a short while it can take care of. But fundamentally, why China is respected is that China has taken care of its basic problems of poverty, underdevelopment, and widespread deprivation. You look at the statistics of multidimensional poverty, in China it's less than 1%, just as is in Kerala, but not in India. It's 27% in India, which is one of the highest among countries. So that's a basic challenge. Well, Then you have tough political challenges, and two tough political challenges are how do you deal with your border issue with China and Pakistan. Pakistan is also important because it can, it may not be able to function just like China in dominating world stage, but it can create problems, both moral and otherwise, because you can change anything in foreign affairs, but not your neighbor. So you have to live with these two countries, and you have to have a more realistic policies. I'll end by that and just sum up by saying, although we might feel excited about the possibilities provided by a very tragic situation as Ukraine, things were taking place even before in terms of deglobalization that has been well documented. But a point has reached when the world has to think differently and move towards a more satisfactory solution for all countries. The best forum is the United Nations. Whether that will happen or not, it will depend on BRICS and the BRICS Plus initiatives. If they take that initiative, then it will be very difficult for the West to oppose that. And thirdly, while we have opportunities, we also have threats. And one of the threats is our internal economic and social strength. I'll end by that, and thank you so much.
During the Russia-Ukraine crisis, there were so much discussions regarding the Indian stand on the issue, and so many people argued that the government of India has not had a clear stand on the issue, and so many discussions were had about Chinese yuan or Japanese yen or something like that, replacing the possibilities of replacing US dollar as a vehicle currency as India, China, Russia, some possibilities of a coherence there. So I want to ask you that recently IMF has published the data that more than after 1990 there is an increase in 20% that the euro and dollar accounts for the foreign exchange transactions of India. So will there be the possibilities of any other vehicle currency like Chinese yuan replacing dollar in near or distant future?
Well, I'll give a quick answer. I have already shown that Chinese reserve accounts for only less than 3% of the total reserves. So some countries are using, and Chinese yuan might be used as a reserve in the coming years by Saudi Arabia and maybe other countries. But it still will be a small proportion compared to the total and even compared to the dollar. And dollar giving way to the other currencies is a possibility, but it's not going to happen very soon. It will be a gradual process. But more likely is the regional arrangements, and the BRICS have already initiated a process where a BRICS reserve currency could be created. I assume that it might start with a swapping arrangement. That means no currency, but whenever there is a problem, that we can swap our currencies and help each other. The second one will be you can denominate a basket of currencies, like the SDR. SDR is a universal one, but SDR is still special drawing rights, is not still used very much. The West doesn't allow its expansion, so very small. After 1979, the quota release was 2009, after the financial crisis. But if they agree to a reform of the SDR, then that might partly take care of some of the complaints of the developing countries.
Sir, thanks for your wonderful lecture. You have covered a very wide area. See, for our international transaction, we are using the official exchange rate. And for the comparison and for the legal purpose only, we are taking this purchasing parity. And actually, this creates a more international disparity and inequality between countries when they make trade or any other transactions. So in this context, how can you rectify this problem, sir? Because Only after rectifying this, only we can remove this international disparity in transaction, etc.
Well, this disparity will continue. Um, because although there is a common basket to compare the prices, things like advanced technologies don't come in. So the ability of the countries like United States and Europe and all that to have an upper hand on advanced technology and advanced products, for example, the ability to produce very effective vaccines during COVID, still lies with them. And so long as those are priced in their currencies, this disparity, this dualism will continue. But when the developing countries are, progressively catching up, if you take the example of China, now the disparity between official dollar and the Chinese in PPP terms has reduced, if not eliminated, because China has much more economic strength, per capita income has gone up. So many things are priced international pricing terms, especially technologies, automobiles, medicine, a whole range of things. When that happens, then this will reduce. That means they are attaining, in some respects, the standard of life of the other countries. So it will be a slow process. It will be a slow process. Or it may widen also. If you go down, then it may widen also.
Sir, I have 3 questions. Sir, post-COVID, we've been seeing a regrouping in global supply chains, which is more in line with geopolitical considerations rather than economic or business considerations. So how far would such realignment be sustainable? And then, do you see a future change in the global financial architecture where the weight shifts from IMF and World Bank to newer institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the New Development Bank? And so thirdly...
Oh my God, third. Okay. Unless I forget, can I deal with the first 2? And then you can ask me some concession to people getting old. The first thing is what you said, the geopolitics driving the post-COVID situation, especially in vaccine distribution. Actually, what's your name? Meera. You are a student here. Very good. Meera, post-COVID is a decisive movement in this realignment that I talked about. Because the United Nations started a COVAX program, a common pool program, so that countries with vaccines and the ability to produce vaccines contribute to that pool, and then it will distribute to countries which is not in a position to produce, poorer countries and all that. But what we saw was that in Europe, UK, America, the West basically, they were driven by what is called in the literature a vaccine nationalism. Of course, their vaccine nationalism was not confined to their countries, vaccine white nationalism. Because if you look at the new production of vaccine in Oxford, it is also in collaboration with some of the laboratories in the United States. And the Pfizer also collaborated with the German, the new method of vaccine, which came as Moderna. So they collaborated easily. So this divide between West and the rest became much more pronounced. And more importantly, Joe Biden and Boris Johnson, under their leadership, they accumulated and bought vaccines 3 times or 4 times more than their population, just in case. They could have easily given away the surplus for an international system. That would have increased their credibility. Now, interestingly, it is the Chinese, Indian and Russian vaccines that were easily made available, although we had our problem because so much of demand. So we had to suspend our production to other countries. We were a big producer of vaccines. Our Poonawalla in Pune, because we have a history of vaccine production. We are the major suppliers of vaccine to the world because we have perfected the art of reproducing. Not the first stage of discovery, but its production. But even that had to be catered to us first. That affected a little bit, but not so much because we also contributed to the COVAX. So that really was a turning point in the anti-Western sentiments of the developing countries. The second question was?
New development plan.
New development. That's a very good question because IMF and World Bank has a monopoly over providing. First, IMF provides your short-term liquidity loans to bridge your trade deficit, okay? And World Bank gives you money when you go for loans for development projects. The voting system is such that the majority voting is with the Americans and the Europeans. But Americans have 16% voting because 16% equity is with them. But they have also written down in the rules in 1944-45 that decisions on major decisions cannot be taken without a majority of 85%. You will never get 85% because unless America joins, you will get only 84%. Even if all the other countries combine, you will not get. So effectively, American decision is the main decision. That's why American president appoints the World Bank president. You can ask a World Bank which is created by all countries by subscribing equities. But one country appoints the president. And they agreed among themselves that the Europeans will appoint the managing director of IMF. So it's their play. So we run the world. So just be quiet. Don't ask too many questions. We'll give you whatever little bit you want. So the BRICS took this initiative, and I think it's the Chinese who took the initiative because they had the money to begin with. But the Russians will never get an upper hand in IMF or World Bank because the West will never allow. Even if they have become capitalists, but even then, no. The first one was the New Development Bank. It's headquartered in Shanghai. It is on the. It's a mixture between IMF and World Bank because it gives money for both projects and also for your short-term requirements. But its equity base is much lower than a World Bank. So it's a regional bank type, like an ADB type. But to that extent, but it's very cleverly, the BRICS allowed any country to come and contribute to its equity. Because they will get a profit also, but not the voting rights. The founders will have the majority, 51%. So interestingly, they kept control, but allowed the Western money to come. To that extent, the importance of World Bank and IMF has gone down. That's why in these current crisis going on, you don't read about IMF having upper hand or World Bank. There is no word conditionalities now because you are not the only monopoly lender. There are others. And AIIB, which is Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is a replica of the World Bank styled for Asian infrastructure. So some of your project loan requirement, instead of straight going to World Bank, you can go to AIIB and get the money from them for Asian countries. So to that extent, World Bank's importance here also, that they have realized now. So that is the reason why IMF and World Bank no longer talks about austerity, no longer talks about conditionalities. Because in 2008, they just gave it up. When they were hit, they were bailed out. It's all money. They were not asked to tighten their belt, but money was pumped into the system by both Europe and by Americans to overcome the crisis. Of course, they also persuaded the G20 other countries. We also did a little bit. But that's the step. So the ideological power extra economic power of IMF and World Bank has already come down. And coupled with the fact that what I told you, the countries are now increasing their reserves because they don't want to go and be, told to change their policies and all that. So big countries like China, Turkey, India, Indonesia, they can manage with the reserves. It's a smaller countries like Sri Lanka or Pakistan or some other countries, coupled with their bad governance of their presidents, looting a lot of the money and foreign projects in the name of development. Such people are invulnerable. What's the third question?
Sir, regarding internationalization of rupee, are we actually ready for the risks associated with it?
I'm not an expert on that monetary economics, but my common sense says they know the limitations, but they also know it's an opportunity. Because if you have countries in the neighborhood region, for example in the Middle East, South Asia, and Russia certainly, with whom you already have a very active trade relation, and they are willing to accept it, you are also saying that you will accept their currency. So it's bilateral, it's give and take. To that extent, you can avoid the need for dollar reserve. Why should we, pay in dollars to Sri Lanka when they export something or when they import something from India? Why can't we have our own? So it's a kind of not exactly bilateral trade, it's a more kind of group-based trade. And the recent newspaper I read a couple of days ago that 30 countries have already expressed their desire to join the rupee payment mechanism. I'm not surprised by that, but if you take it historically, when we had a tight monetary policy during colonial times, it was not because of the country's virtue, because colonial they didn't want to have an inflationary situation because they want to take out as much as possible in real terms. Indian rupee was a common currency in the Gulf region. If you ask some of our very old people who worked there in the 50s, 40s and 50s, and even up to early 60s, for example, Oman, Dubai and all that, Indian rupee was traded. Malaysia used to have that informal trade. A lot of chettiars from Tamil Nadu used to deal in money exchange in Burma and Malaysia and all that. So there is a possibility that this could be, if not as strong as yuan, you must accept that. But there will be countries who can. And whether we are prepared or not, to the extent that we have a vigorous trade with these countries, yes. But if you have adverse trade with countries and then you go for rupee trade, then it will be a problem. What will you do with the excess rupee which they are holding?
I have two questions. First, according to the lecture, there is the value of the United States dollars is depreciating, it comes down, but in the real life of the financial market, this value is still high power, high power. What is the main result of the backseat of these situations? The second is the last slide, the Indian international challenges. The first two is good, having border with China and Pakistan, because we also have big border. I'm from Afghanistan.
Oh, okay.
With Pakistan, and many challenges, problems develop from these borders to us.
Yes.
And the rest of challenges, for instance, the strengthening of the United Nations systems and South-South cooperation involving this process. What might be the exact challenge of these processes, these systems?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyway, it's nice to have you here from Afghanistan to get what you think from a Afghan point of view or a South Asian point of view. The dollar is stronger now because of American Federal Reserve System's interest rate policy.
Yeah.
They have been raising the interest rates from 0 to 2, 4, now 6.5. Their whole objective is to bring down inflation in America. So it's a national objective. But whenever the interest rates are changed by the Federal Reserve System in the US, because it is a reserve currency, it affects other countries via the availability of dollar. If I am an American financial investor, if my interest rate in America goes up to 6%, I will pull out my investment from India or other countries, China, and put it in the American system, because I will get at least 6.5 interest rate. And many of the developing countries, you cannot get that much real rate of interest, even if you put it in the stock market. Nominal rate may be high, but minus inflation, you will get a lower interest rate. So any interest rate change will affect the availability of dollar in other countries through the stock market and other investment, also in other ways in terms of dollar trade. Very interestingly, in this time, it has adversely affected the European currencies also. The pound, for example, has depreciated more than Indian rupee or other. Euro has been affected. So if you take our regional currencies against euro and pound, it has not changed much. In fact, we have a slight advantage. So that is also creating problems between Europe and America, because their banking systems are so well integrated. This will intensify the efforts to move away from the dollar, or this will act as an incentive for countries to move away from dollar, because dollar availability itself is becoming difficult. We can't go on paying very high exchange rate, no? And you know what happened in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, for example. At one time, Pakistan and Indian rupee were more or less the same. Now it is what? $1 is Pakistan's 200 rupees.
Exactly, I don't know that. Pakistan in Afghanistan is about 87 rupees.
Afghan against dollar.
Yeah,
But that's exactly like Indian thing.
Like India.
But Pakistan is, I think, it's around 200 rupees. In Sri Lanka, it's around 340 rupees. Can you imagine? So how much the Sri Lankan people are forced to pay for every dollar of import that comes into their country. So this will, in my view, the short answer to your question is, this will also work as an incentive to move away from the dollar. In fact, we will all benefit regionally if we have a regional currency system. If not formal currency, but trading in our own currencies and settling our own accounts to the extent possible. But if I am buying things $100 million from Afghanistan and I am exporting $100 million worth of things to Afghanistan, we can perfectly settle that. If there is an excess, and if the excess is in terms of rupees, you can hold it in the Reserve Bank of India, who will take care of its value by giving you an interest which will neutralize the inflation rate. So this will be, there will be more things will come. That's what experts also, when I've been reading recently some of the IMF texts, they are also predicting that there will be more reserve currencies now, or at least more exchange currencies now. And they say regionalization is not going to be a bad thing, because regionalization will consolidate your regional economies, and that will act as an incentive, and you will also learn from each other how to manage. And in a future scenario, when a global reserve currency is thought of really, this will become a good experience in managing. In fact, if the Europeans are, France especially, they are in favor of a global currency, unattached to any country. France has always taken a slightly different position from the United States, as you can see. The only poodle is the United Kingdom, which goes along with their American masters. So that's it.
Thank you.
What's your name?
Sneha Sarajan.
Sneha.
Thank you for that delightful talk, sir.
Thank you.
As China is creating a string of pearls against India, connecting different points of neighboring countries of India through funding infrastructural facilities in our neighboring countries. Like, how will India be able to overcome this, or as an economy, to what extent or to what intensity will this affect India? And now, as we know, non-alignment movement is also making efforts to reunite and work against this global power. So will their efforts be helping India to work on this? Thank you, sir.
I wish I'm a defense expert. I'm not a defense expert, but Sneha, it sounds like that you are talking like a military general advising the government. Whether it's a string of pearls around India, whether that is their main concern, I don't know. The world knows that China is now obsessed with Taiwan because it is their territory. And Taiwan is not treated as a country by United Nations. It's always called region of China. They had long history because after the revolution, the Chiang Kai-shek and his friends, they fled to Taiwan and established their rebel government. So they want to get it back. That's a different thing. Whether they are really circling India, I don't know. Maybe they are. But that's a defense question. I just can't handle. But I can only say, if they do that with the purpose of containing India in a military sense, both will lose. Both India and China will lose. Because your international credibility in economic and finance depends on your political behavior. So what guarantee is there for other countries, especially Southeast Asia, to accept yuan as a exchange rate currency and reserve currency if they do something else in South Asia? So they will lose very heavily. I doubt whether that is the thing, and I also don't know whether it is pearls, and the Indian defense system is the string of pearls, that they have no counter strategy. I am not so sure. I only know that in the Indian Navy is quite an equal to Chinese Navy, may not be the Air Force and the Army. And traditionally we have been very strong in the presence in the Indian Ocean, including the Strait of Malacca. When the Indonesian tsunami took place, is the Indian naval ships from Andaman which first reached there, of course for relief work. The quickness, the speed is a demonstration of your ability to move your navy quickly. So it's not going to be all that defense ministry spokesperson type of work. There are so many things which are unsaid, in defense. So we just don't know. And this is not 1962 also. China cannot just challenge India just like that. It's not like Russia attacking Ukraine. They will pay a very heavy price. That's why in Galwan, they were not firing each other, they were fisting. Bare hands, pulling and fisting. So you might wonder, in this modern world, these two armies are fighting with their hands. That's diplomacy. Because there's an agreement that in these border lines, no party will carry arms in the no man's land. Because you can also supervise the land, they can also come and patrol the land. So when the politicians want to make an issue of it, then they will tell the patrols, then you go and give them one slap and he will give you something. They make it an issue. I don't know whether they made it, if he made it, I don't know. So that's it. So I can't say. But the prospect of an India-China war, personally, I don't think it's in the scenario.
In the United Nations and South-West Cooperation challenges of India, system,
in the United Nations?
the strengthening of United Nations system and
Yeah.
absence of the involvement of India with that.
Yes. That is a major problem. Certainly, the sidelining of the United Nations has been going on for quite some time. Unfortunately, it is also started by the US. You remember when Trump became the president, the first thing he did was to pull out of United Nations Fund for Population Activities, UNFPA, because they support abortion and his party doesn't support abortion. So he just stopped American contributions to that. Secondly, during in the WHO, during COVID, he asked the WHO, as if it is his department, to go and investigate how the Chinese produced this virus and released it. We don't know how it came. There may be some connection, but we don't know. It's all possible. So WHO said nothing. We are a international institution. We are not a department of the United States government. He pulled out of WHO. It's only after Joe Biden came in. None of the great powers sitting in the UN Security Council. Then they use the UN Security Council when it comes to political issues, to debate and to challenge each other. They want the United Nations Security Council. But they don't want to take its permission before engaging in any combat. Because the understanding when the UN was established, that if there is a situation to interfere militarily in a country because of genocide, human rights violations, or any other weak country being attacked by a strong country, you need explicit authorization of the United Nations through the Security Council. That means all the 5 powers have to agree. In no war in Afghanistan, they never bothered when they attacked Afghanistan. George Bush said, either you are with us or you are against us. In Iraq, they made it that they have all the weapons of mass destruction. When they went there, they couldn't get even a decent gun. So they used it as a pretext and without authorization. They bombed Yugoslavia, the Belgrade, for 79 days continuously by President Bill Clinton, because they wanted to disintegrate Yugoslavia, because it was standing as a independent country, not aligning with the European Union. Because it had already, earlier it had come out of the Soviet influence, but they were an independent. They didn't like that. In the Mediterranean, Eastern European, in that Balkan region, no? They didn't want an independent country. So they made it into 6 countries. So it is a matter of great worry. And I suppose all the powers will have to decide. And reform of the United Nations is a long pending agenda that also they don't want to undertake. Even when countries have agreed, let there be Germany be there, let Japan be there, but along with 2 or 3 other developing countries like Brazil, India and South Africa or Nigeria. But Pakistan will never agree if India to be a permanent member. Argentina will never agree Brazil becoming. China will never agree Japan to be. Your history weighs you down, and that's real politics.
Of the Nord Stream supplies, there has been a fear, especially among the German economists, that Germany is going to lose their comparative cost advantage with the robust logistics that they had built up in the early years. So, how can the sunshine economies, especially countries like India, can capitalize on it, especially in the context of ISA, International Solar Alliance, which currently is the 2nd largest grouping of nations after the United Nations. Also, we have the problem of India. Is India an outlier when you consider the rest and the West? Because we even still now have economic relationship with at least 2 of the countries in the West, Australia and Japan. So, how far or how close can we get with the West? That's it.
Yes. Very good questions, but difficult ones. What's your name? Atul.
Atul. ATHU.
Atul. Incomparable.
Atul.
Atul എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ Germany is worried. Their Nord Stream is not destroyed. The UK did some spy work and then put a blast in their pipe. They can repair easily. That's not a problem. The problem is Germany was dependent on cheap Russian gas and oil, 40% of their consumption. And that was actually very advantageous to German productivity, assured supply, cheaper oil. And we didn't know to that extent that it was dependent on Russia. We thought it was all German strength. But Germany is a remarkable country. They have overcome more, much serious challenges. Integration was one, East and West Germany, how they will integrate. And East Germany, there was a lot of dissatisfaction that, East Germans didn't get a fair deal. Their highly skilled people were made to work for low-paid jobs and all kinds of things. But they have overcome that. They are very disciplined and workers. They don't start classes at 10 o'clock in the morning. They start at 8 o'clock. I did my PhD in Netherlands. They are also the same. Everything starts at 8 o'clock, 8 to 5. Whether it's a factory or university or a shop. So factory, we say you come at 8 o'clock, but in the classroom you come at 10 o'clock and go at 4 o'clock. And if you are a government servant, you come at 10:30 and go at 3:30.
Yes.
There is a message in that. Because you, as a society, you must, some people, if you are a Weberian, Max Weber, he will put it to the Protestant ethic. Work is worship.
Yes.
Work is worship. So to be a worker itself is a pride. But any work, whether you are a teacher or a plumber, doesn't matter. We don't have that, no? So I like your suggestion that why can't we take advantage of that, provided you change all these habits. You means the country, not you. Which is very important. The productivity, when East Asia had this miracle growth, high growth, Paul Krugman wrote that 80% perspiration, 20% inspiration. That means it's not all because all their intelligence that made it increase the productivity and high growth. 80% was perspiration. They worked very hard. I went to China several times, and one of the factories, in a textile factory and a big shopping mall and all that. My Chinese interpreters were there. So I asked, the lady was in the shop, how many hours you work? First she said, actually officially 8 hours. I said, what is officially 8 hours? I work 10 hours and the 2 hours I have to work is called overtime. Are you paid? Yes, I am paid. But I can't say no to overtime.
Yes.
So she has to work 10 hours every day. 8 hours is official. 2 hours you are accounted as overtime. You are paid, but you can't opt out. It's as good as 10 hours. That is perspiration. It's the same thing with, workers. They provide dormitories and good accommodation facilities for thousands of young girls, young women coming from rural areas to work in the textile manufacturing. So if you go and look at, we were taken to their dormitories, very well provided for, bathrooms and, clean rooms and everything is there. But you can't leave the campus. You can go once a year to your home. Of course, you can go for some shopping and for restricted hours. It's like college timings here. Girls should be back by 6:30 in the hostel. Similar kind of, much more authoritarian than we have here. They are paid reasonably well, but 11 months, after 11 months, 1 month they can go home. Because Chinese New Year is a very great celebration and everybody comes together, family, much more family oriented than us. Even India as it is, we are burdened by family. They are double burdened by family. Everything in the family. But when they come back, they'll be taken as new workers. So you work for 11 months every year. That way you don't pay for your long-term service. But we can do some, some advantages we already have. For example, automobiles now. For the first time, we are one of the major exporters of automobiles, cars especially. And I was reading the other day that thanks to Western sanctions against Russia, now the Russian have started buying Indian-made cars. And Scorpio is a big hit in Russia. Mahindra Scorpio. So somebody's loss is somebody else's gain, provided you are ready and willing. And the relationship between Australia, the Quad, you are talking about the Quad arrangement. No? It's not a military alliance, although Americans would like it to be a military alliance. So far it is not in the real sense. But these are strategic plays. No? The Chinese also will play games against you. In South China Sea, they wouldn't... India wants to help Vietnam, and even we have a agreement with them. We don't publicize that. We have gone into South China Sea and helping Vietnam to explore oil there, which is a contested oil field, and China says it's my area. Vietnam says it's mine. Philippines says no, it's mine. Malaysia says no, it's mine. So South China is a contested area, and we are also making our presence, giving a signal to China, if you do like this here, we will do like this here. So these are strategic plays that will continue. That's what I said, our biggest challenge for the BRICS countries is for India, China to settle their issues.